Before the world heard his voice, millions already knew his face. But behind the laughter was a childhood filled with poverty, hunger, and uncertainty. Then he created a strange little character and changed cinema forever. His name was Charlie Chaplin, but his story was not always funny. Charlie Chaplin was born in London in 1889. Years before he became one of the most famous men in the world, Charlie was simply a poor child trying to survive. His parents were performers in music halls. His father was a singer, and his mother, Hannah, was a singer and actress. But the family had very little money, and Charlie's father was often absent. Life became even harder when his mother's health began to fail. Charlie and his older half-brother, Sidney, sometimes had almost nothing to eat. At one point, they were sent to a workhouse, a place where very poor people received food and shelter in exchange for strict institutional life. For a young child, it was a frightening experience. But something unusual was already growing inside Charlie. He watched people carefully, the way they walked, the way they spoke, and the strange little movements they made. Then, when Charlie was still a boy, the stage gave him an escape. He began performing professionally and discovered that he could make people laugh. The poor boy from London had no idea yet. But those small performances were the first steps toward a completely different life. As Charlie grew older, performing became more than an escape. It became his profession. He joined a famous British comedy company led by Fred Karno. The company performed physical comedy, where actors could make audiences laugh with movement, timing, and expression. Then came the opportunity that changed Charlie's life. He traveled to the United States with the company. America was becoming the center of a new kind of entertainment, motion pictures. In 1913, Charlie received an offer to work for Keystone Studios in California. He was young, ambitious, and still learning how movies worked. Then, in 1914, something extraordinary happened. For one of his films, Charlie put together a strange costume, baggy trousers, oversized shoes, a tight coat, a small bowler hat, a cane, and a tiny mustache. The pieces did not seem to belong together. But when Charlie started walking in that costume, a character suddenly came alive. He looked poor but tried to behave like a gentleman. He could be proud, clever, romantic, and ridiculous at the same time. Audiences loved him. The character became known as the Little Tramp. Charlie Chaplin had finally found the character that would make him famous around the world. But fame was only the beginning. The Little Tramp became a sensation. People did not need to understand English to enjoy Charlie Chaplin. His films were silent, and his comedy was built on movement, emotion, and simple human situations. Soon, audiences around the world recognized the bowler hat, the cane, and that unforgettable walk. But Charlie wanted more than fame. He wanted control. He began writing and directing his own films, carefully planning every movement and every joke. He could repeat a scene again and again until it looked exactly the way he wanted. And his success gave him something very unusual for an actor: power. In 1919, Chaplin joined Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and director D.W. Griffith to create United Artists. Now, he could have much greater control over his own movies. And Chaplin used that freedom to make films that were more than simple comedy. In movies like The Kid, he mixed laughter with sadness. His characters were often poor, hungry, or alone. Perhaps Charlie understood them so well because he remembered the streets of his own childhood. By the 1920s, the poor boy from London had become an international superstar. But Hollywood was about to change. For the first time, audiences were going to hear movie stars speak. And Charlie Chaplin had a difficult decision to make. By the late 1920s, cinema was changing quickly. Audiences could finally hear actors speak, and silent movies began disappearing from theaters. But Charlie Chaplin had a problem. What would happen if the little tramp suddenly had a voice? The character belonged to everyone. People from different countries could understand him without hearing a single word. So Chaplin took a huge risk. While Hollywood rushed toward sound, he continued making films that were mostly silent. In 1931, he released City Lights. Many people thought silent cinema was already finished. But the film became a major success. Then came Modern Times in 1936. Chaplin used comedy to show a world of machines, factories, and workers struggling to keep up with modern life. But outside the cinema, something much darker was happening. Adolf Hitler had taken power in Germany. Chaplin noticed something strange. Hitler's small mustache looked remarkably similar to the tramp's. So Chaplin decided to use that similarity. In 1940, he released The Great Dictator, openly mocking Hitler and fascism. And near the end of the film, Chaplin did something audiences had rarely experienced. He stood before the camera and spoke. After decades of making the world laugh without words, Charlie Chaplin finally used his voice. And what followed would help change the direction of his life. By the 1940s, Charlie Chaplin was still famous. But his life outside the cinema had become increasingly controversial. His political opinions attracted attention, especially during a period when fear of communism was growing in the United States. Chaplin was not an American citizen, even after living in the country for decades. The FBI collected information about him, and some politicians and newspapers attacked him publicly. His personal life also became the subject of intense public criticism. The man who had once made almost everyone laugh was now becoming a deeply controversial figure in America. Then, in 1952, Chaplin left the United States with his family. He was traveling to Europe to promote his new film, Limelight. But while he was crossing the Atlantic, he received shocking news. The American government had revoked his re-entry permit. If he wanted to return, he would have to appear before immigration authorities and answer questions about his politics and behavior. Chaplin was furious. Instead of fighting to return, he made a decision. He would leave America behind. He eventually settled with his family in Switzerland. After almost 40 years connected to Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin had lost the country where he had built his movie empire. But his story with America was not finished yet. 20 years later, Hollywood would ask him to come back. For 20 years, Charlie Chaplin stayed away from the United States. He lived quietly with his family in Switzerland, far from the Hollywood studios that had made him famous. Then, in 1972, something unexpected happened. The Academy invited Chaplin back to Hollywood to receive an honorary Oscar for his extraordinary contribution to cinema. He accepted. When the 82-year-old Chaplin entered the ceremony, the audience stood and applauded. The man who had left America under controversy was now being welcomed back as a legend. It was an emotional return. Chaplin went back to Switzerland, where he spent the final years of his life. In 1975, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him. And on Christmas Day, 1977, Charlie Chaplin died at his home in Switzerland. He was 88 years old. But the little tramp never really disappeared. More than a century after Chaplin first put on the bowler hat and picked up the cane, people around the world still recognize him. And perhaps that is what made Charlie Chaplin extraordinary. Before cinema needed words, he showed that a simple movement could tell a story. A smile could hide sadness. And sometimes, you do not need to understand every word to understand a human being.